everyone, and welcome back. Have you ever looked back on a project and thought, I could do better than that now? Not necessarily that there was anything wrong with the first time around, just you could do better now. You know more, you understand more, maybe there's more information available about the garment, or maybe just you know better what's going to work for you and your body than you did back then. Well, that is definitely the case for me with a gown that I made, I think about 10 years ago. It's a very lovely, lightweight gown from around 1805, and I loved that gown so terribly much. I found the absolute perfect fabric to reproduce it, and I put a lot of time and effort into that, and it was beautiful. But looking back now, long after I've sold it and no longer have it in hand, there are better images of it online, and I can do a better reproduction. I can do a better fit. I can just in general do more with it and make it so I'm happier with that garment than I was with the original. So that's what I am tackling today, a 10-year-old fix in a way. Unfortunately, as I said, I don't have the original gown anymore, and even if I did, I used every tiny little scrap of fabric to make it the first time around. I had no leftovers. There was no ability for me to adjust that gown, and especially not on the scale that I would adjust it today. Not just for size, but also to make it more true to the original or better suited to what I need. So the changes that I'm going to make come in a few forms. For one, I know that I really didn't like the back closure. It's not that it wasn't beautiful. All of those buttons down the back, loved the look of them. However, I don't like not being able to get myself in and out of a gown. It bothers me a lot, and there are times where that's not a choice. But in the case of this era of gowns, there is no reason that I need to put myself into the situation of not being able to put this thing on quickly and easily by myself. So I knew that I wanted to make a front closure to this, which shouldn't be too hard. A lot of the elements are already there. The straps that go up to the buttons and buttonholes, that just needs to be functional buttons and buttonholes rather than purely decorative. And a lot of the side openings and things, very easy to translate into a front closure gown. So I'm going to do that. I thought about leaving the back closure on this gown. I thought about leaving the buttons and buttonholes, but one, it's kind of obviously superfluous, doesn't need to be there. And two, more importantly, there are going to be garments that I want to make that go over this, and sometimes those buttons will be too busy or actually physically be in the way, be interacting with something like a bodice or an overcorset. So I decided to just scrap that part and do a plain back. It makes it much more practical and functional for a lot of different styles for me to have a plain back. So I'm making that choice, and honestly, that's most of the changes that I'm going to make. When it comes to doing the gown better than I did last time, not only am I going to make sure that, well, one, the front bodice is better fit, I ended up spending a lot of time pleating down these panels and making sure that they looked right and beautiful, really delicate, tiny, tiny multiple pleats crisscrossing across. It was very complex, but it ended up too small. And as I discovered in this making process, wasn't the right shape either. So it was always a little too tight across the bust. It didn't really drape in the right way. Additionally, I also know from looking at the zoomable images on the museum website that the gown isn't 2 straight panels, or for that matter, 3 straight panels of fabric. They do have 2 straight panels in the back, but the front is an angle. Not only is the front itself angled towards the top where it's narrower up at the waist, which makes perfect sense, there's less bulk up there then, but there are piecings done on either side in order to flare the skirt out the whole way down. So the front piece needs to have a trapezoidal angle to it. This is not something that I did on the original so far as I can recall. So I'm going to make that change, which actually will benefit me in terms of making this a front closure gown as well. I think that's going to be easier. I am also going to, unfortunately and fortunately, not put all those tiny little pleats in. So those tiny little hand-stitched tucks are gorgeous and work very well for that particular type of fabric. However, the fabric design that I have is a stripe. It's a woven in stripe, and it's not an even one. It means that there's a single bold stripe and then 3 sort of wavy lines running back and forth that make up what feels like a chunkier stripe. This won't look good with the pleats. It's not an even stripe, so the pleating can't be done in an even way to match up with the stripes well. The pleating is also done 2 different ways. It's sort of an X pattern, and it's just gonna compete with the stripe, especially since both the sleeves and the front part of the bodice on the original are done on the bias. So it's just gonna look weird to have a very uneven and unbalanced stripe down the front and on the sleeves. So what I'm doing instead is keeping the diagonal on the sleeves, so that way the stripe runs on the diagonal, which I think will have a nice effect. That's pretty common to find. It is also common to find the front panel of a gown on the diagonal. You can see both on the straight and on the diagonal. I chose, however, to keep it on the straight. In fact, I'm running those stripes horizontally, so that way as it sort of gathers up and falls towards the middle, it will have a very nice bordering effect. So that's a choice that I'm making that's not going to be true to the original, but it's better for the fabric that I have. And sometimes you just have to make those sacrifices in a way. Although this does also mean this gown will be much faster to make and I don't have to do all those tiny pleats again. I'm not mad about that. I'm also going to add a little bit more of a train than I had on my original version. The actual extant gown has a fair amount of a train, and I want to try and copy that a little bit closer. This is basically going to be using every inch that I can of the fabric that I have in order to get the longest train possible within reason. And yes, I do end up using nearly every inch. I only have the tiniest scraps left. Again, I am going to be smart this time and save at least one moderate-sized brick-sized about scrap. That's all I had left. So it's a very economical cut, thankfully. So in reality, there's not that many changes to what I did. It's mostly going to be changing back closure, front closure, and getting rid of those little stitched tucks around the body. So that way it better flatters the fabric, better flatters my body, and makes it easier for me to get in and out of. So these are all choices that I'm making. I don't want to think of them as compromises, but many of these things are being done with the mindset of I can make this fit and look better than the original did. And I really loved the original. I just feel like I can look back on it now and know that I can do more. I can get more out of it and make it a more useful and better garment for me. And in the end, hopefully, I will be able to love this one for a lot longer than I got to spend with the first one. Of course, the base pattern comes from the mock-up that I figured out in last week's video, and I'm just changing up the shape a little bit. I wanted the back to be a little bit shorter and a little bit more narrow. The height of the back neckline I know was good. The overall fit was pretty good. I just wanted to bring the sleeves in towards the center back and also have a slightly more narrow appearance to the back. This should mean some adjustments to the front piece, but it won't be a lot. For the front, I'm trying to figure out at this point whether or not I actually want to have a front closure, so I'm going ahead and drawing it out as if I don't. There is that dart that should be there between the strap and the front, but I'm getting rid of that for the moment. I don't think it's going to be that important. I'm also making some adjustments to the side of the front, so that way it is the same height. It falls back far enough. Since I took away some from the back, I need to add it to the front, etc., etc. I also straightened out the bottom edge just because this gave me the appropriate shape and length for everything since I was raising up the center back and making some other adjustments. So this is what I ended up with at first, with the separate strap and the sort of false button front. This is also when I stood there for a good long while considering, do I want to get myself into this back, and decided, no, I don't. So I created an entire front piece that goes up and over, and the little strap for the button will actually be on the side of that front rectangle, and that's how the gown will close. It's a very small adjustment to the overall pattern, and really won't be visible that it's terribly different than the original, but will make a fairly big difference in how I interact with the gown. Another consideration I had was whether or not to line the bodice of the gown. The original, it's really hard to tell if it is actually lined or not, but I decided because of the way that I was going to deal with the front closure and everything else, it made more sense for me to go ahead and put a very lightweight lining in the gown, so that way I don't have to worry about having a bodiced petticoat or something underneath that will make sure nothing will be visible through the sheer fabric. This also meant that because it's a front closure and because I'm partially lining it, it's going to be really good for me to have a little piece of white linen that runs across to the front underneath the sort of gathered up drapey sheer part. This will help hide any sort of undergarments that I choose, so it's just a basic rectangle of linen at this point that will be sort of seamed on, and that will actually allow me to have the dart shaping under the bust. I'm going ahead and stitching up the fronts, stitching around the edges that I can, basting everything together, so that way I am ready to do the fitting where the back side seam overlaps and where the shoulders will overlap as well. So I'm avoiding doing any work in those areas. It's basically just the front neckline that's getting finished. And even down at the bottom of the front, I'm leaving that open because that's where those little panels of linen are going to go together that will pin in the center front in order to keep the main part of the gown bodice closed, and then the front panel will go up over that. For that center front rectangle, the only thing I'm going ahead and doing is hemming the top line. I know where this has to be based off of the repeat of the stripes, which, like I said, I'm running those horizontally, so that way it has a really nice effect. Then the whole thing can be fitted. The things that I'm adjusting here are those shoulder seams, the side back seam area, and how those linen pieces interact with the front. The whole thing fit really well off the bat. I didn't have to adjust any of the back parts. I just had to adjust how the linen pieces in front and the side pieces with the straps actually interacted with each other. I then pinned on the front panel, which I just pinned on those tabs. I didn't stitch them on because I had an inkling that part of the thing I did wrong last time was that I came up with a rectangle to work with, and that doesn't really make sense. How can you have it taut across your underbust, which is smaller, than across your bust where it needs to be large and drapey? So this has to be a trapezoid where it's larger at the top. I tried this out, it worked very well, but it also meant that I realized very quickly that the center front was going to drape down too low for not only the bodice petticoat that I had on, but also for the little linen panels that I had put across the front. What I'm going to do in terms of the linen panels is the top line of those needs to angle down about 1.5 inches towards the center, and they will be out of the way. The bodice petticoat, though, that's a bit of a different problem. At this point, I also knew that I was going to be using a different petticoat because I had forgotten in making this bodice petticoat that I was going to be cutting out something with a train. And I probably wanted a train length under petticoat, which I have, but it doesn't have a bodice. So a couple of choices being made here. Am I going to need another support garment underneath? Am I going to need a corset underneath this? I don't know. I'm hoping that that linen panel in front might actually be enough between that and the shift to manage this, because this era, they're very natural in their shaping, and a lot of those portraits, I don't think they have anything on underneath. I don't think they can, or if they do, it's not much. There's no visible lines, there's a separation between the bust, and you can't really achieve that with a lot of the different support systems. So for right now, I think I've got the right overall size of that front panel. I think I know how far I need to lower those little linen pieces. The bodice itself fits very well, and we will continue to figure out that whole front bust area issue as we go. Here you can see the angle that I needed for those little linen panels, that sort of essentially creating the dart. And then we're just going to re-stitch the top line of those down a little bit further. I'm also transferring over the lines of where the back and the sides are going to overlap, using pins for that. I don't really like the heat-sensitive pens. I just don't use them, and chalk on this is going to likely be really hard to remove if I use a colored chalk, so I'm just going to use pins. Then I don't have to worry about any marks being left over, discoloring the fabric. The entire gown is pretty much made up of two main types of stitches. We have a spaced back stitch that top stitches down all of the seams, and I'm using a little felling stitch around the outside edges for the lining when it gets folded back and encompasses the seam allowances. And those are pretty much the two main stitches for most of the body. I do occasionally use some running stitch back stitch stuff in the skirt, as you'll see, but most of the body is top stitched and visible in a way. It's not a stitch a seam from the inside and open it up and make it visible. I'm doing all of these top stitches and felling stitches because they're really strong, and on such a delicate fabric, it's better to go through multiple layers of the fabric than to just hope that the two layers will hold each other together. Sleeves, I decided to use a mantua maker stitch. This is a pretty simple thing where you're just going to line up the two edges. You can have them offset slightly, where the one on top is slightly further back, about 1/4 of an inch or so, and then you roll it twice. Fold over along that cut edge, and then fold it over once again, and fell that down. So it's no different than folding up the edge of a garment and roll hemming it. You're just doing it through 2 layers at once. And it creates a felled edge on one side, and it kind of looks like a running stitch on the other side. This is not going to be something you use for incredibly stressed seams, but on the skirts of a gown, this is the perfect way to finish off your seam and make your seam in the same stitch. The bottom of the sleeve is then just turned up to make a casing, and the entire sleeve is backstitched in. For the skirts, I'm doing a combination of running stitches and back stitches. This number of running stitches to back stitches just depends on the weight of the fabric, the size of your stitches, the size of your needle, the amount of stress your seam's going to get. It's up to you. I just like to put in that little back stitch every 6 to 8 stitches as a sort of locking mechanism. I knew that the front of the skirt needed to go ahead and be back stitched and seamed to the front part of the bodice. So I went ahead and did that, and the extra on the sides is going to be gathered up by way of a drawstring, which is what's going to sort of wrap the whole thing around my waist. The back is going to be stitched on a little bit differently. The only thing I really had to be making sure of here was that where I had the sides matching up looked correct. There are lots of different ways that you can do drop front gowns. You can have the front be on top, you can have the front be sort of underneath and tie around the bottom, all sorts of choices. I just had to make sure that where the opening occurred on the sides was even, especially since one of those was on the angle and the other was on the straight grain. And I had to make sure that there was the correct placement of this, where it fell on the body, that it created fullness where it needed to get over my hips and not pull. There's just options here, and best bet, look at a bunch of originals. There are so many examples in books and online as to how they did this. I chose to just simply fold up and seam down the front skirt and fold over those edges that extended off of the front panel, put a drawstring through them, and then the back part of the skirt, like the original, which I could zoom in far enough on, gets top stitched with a spaced back stitch up until the point where the gathers occur in the very center back, which, as with many of these types of gowns, is centered up over just that back panel. It doesn't go into the side panels. So keep this in mind. If you have a really heavy fabric with lots of gathers, it's going to be kind of hard to get it spaced into a really tiny back. But pleats are another option, and of course the gathers can go out further than your center back panel. It's just really common this way. The actual gathered portion, instead of being top stitched down or very carefully felled down with each little gather, it just seems like they backstitched through the whole thing. Just turned it to the inside, went right side to right side, and backstitched through all of those big chunky gathers. It turns out just fine on the outside. It's a little bit wonky. It's not a perfect appearance, but it works and it's fast and it's easy. Is only folded up about 3/4 of an inch to an inch on the original, which is what I did, so only around 2 centimeters. And this is better than doing a really big wide hem, because 1, that wastes a lot of fabric, and 2, you're working on a curve when you have a train like this, and trying to get the larger hem up around a curve, not easy. So definitely stick to inch or less unless you want to put a facing in. The very last steps that I had to do at the end of the day was just to do the 2 buttonholes at the front, so that way I can actually close up the gown, make 3 little covered buttons to go with those buttonholes, and down at the center front. The original uses little bone rings that are bigger than the ones that I had in stock, and I didn't think far enough ahead to order new ones. So mine won't be embroidered in the same way or finished in the same way, but they're going to give a pretty similar effect, considering I have this really nice little fabric design on the stripe to use.